Just a big thank you, Debbie. Really appreciate you chatting with us. And I know you and Jess go way back, and I'm excited to hear more about that and, just appreciate the conversation.
I'm so excited when I was like, Jess, no way. It's like people from high school come back in interesting, awesome ways. So
Okay, with that, I think we could probably just transition into show officially. Debbie, thank you for coming on the PLA podcast. I'm so excited for multiple reasons, one of which you're a bit of an atypical guest for us because you're not
Yay.
coming from specifically the HR space or the people world, but you talk about a lot of really interesting things related to it. In your blog, PsykoBabble, which I follow, every single post that you post has just gems of wisdom that make me think and rethink the way that I look at things. And then also because you have some really interesting work as a cultural psychologist. I can't wait to dive into more of what does that mean? But the other reason why I'm super excited to have you on the show is that we go way back. And when I say guests go way back, usually it's a decade or more. But in the case of Debbie and me, we actually go back to being children. We were childhood friends. We hung out a lot in middle school and high school. I don't know how many of those stories will come up here, but if anybody is from Leland High School, go Chargers. Shout out to our classmates. This is a mini reunion that we're doing here on the podcast. Those who don't know you in the audience, could you introduce yourself to them and a bit about the arc of your background and what you do now?
So my name is Debbie, and I am a cultural psychologist, which we can get into in a sec, because I think whenever I say that, everyone's like, what is that? So I live in Singapore right now, working for a tech company. But my trajectory has been a bit weird because I was in academia for a while and then moved into tech. But I've always been interested in culture and digital psychology. So now what I do is I translate a lot of my knowledge about psychology to help tech teams, marketers, or with my PsykoBabble, I hopefully help business leaders as they're trying to build with, empathy or connection, just trying to understand either consumers or users or just everyday people better. So yeah, that's sort of where my long trajectory has taken me all the way from the US into Singapore.
Yes, I love how you have that cultural lens too of having grown up in the US and now being on the other side of the world. For those who don't know what a cultural psychologist is, do you mind breaking that down a little bit so that we can get even more understanding of what you do?
Yeah, so a cultural psychologist, it's actually a small branch of social psychology. So if social psychology is about all the different things around us that affect how we think, feel, behave, cultural psychology is trying to articulate the very invisible layers of culture and how the things that we've grown up with, our education system, the traditions that we have, the language that we use, how those all shape our perceptions of right and wrong, or how we feel about certain things, or even our behavior. So cultural psychology is really about trying to understand if there are differences in terms of some of the psychology that we learn about in Psych 101, and do they actually apply the same way? And are there differences when you go outside of, for instance, the US?
Love it. And I think it's especially relevant for our audience because we think about culture a lot in the setting of a company and how to encourage that culture, cultivate it, what changes that culture, and why I was especially excited for you to come on the show.
And there are lots of linkages as well as some of the conversations that we've had on our show previously. We chatted, Debbie, with Daniel Illis, who's a longtime friend of People Leader Accelerator, who talked about driving dramatic growth, the differences between US, UK, and Europe, specifically Lithuania versus London, shockingly different in some ways. There's real live business application to these cultural differences, especially as we become increasingly global. So I'm really excited. If you're willing, I'd love to explore a little further, maybe in some detail. I understand that you've been leading culture map workshops based off of Aaron Meyer's framework. And before I ask you about the spiciest culture maps and the biggest missteps, which I will, so get ready for that, would love for you to share maybe with our audience members that may not know what a culture map workshop is or may not be as aware of Aaron Meyer's work. Could you give us, just a quick primer on what that is? And then let's talk about it a little bit more.
Yeah, so we had actually reached out to Erin Mayer because the book that she wrote was resonating with a lot of people in the company. And especially because when you work in a global company or multinational company, you realize very quickly that there's friction points that you weren't anticipating. And so we had talked to her about, like what are some of the ways that we can incorporate some of the things that you have seen. So she wrote this book called Culture Map, and she had interviewed a whole bunch of managers across the world to identify some of those friction points and some of the things that you can do to address those. And so from my perspective, how we have run it is really to make sure that people are aware that there are the differences in the first place. Because I think when you're not aware of your own culture, you are automatically going to assume when somebody does something differently that it must be wrong or it's weird. And so when you can start showing people it's not wrong, it's different, and this is the reason why it's different, it allows people to sort of step back and at least give people more grace and be more curious. A lot of times when people do these workshops, it's like, well, give me do these things, and all of a sudden everything will be fine. And I think you have to actually just start from what are those differences? Why am I coming from this place of my own cultural bias? So that's why I think people want more things, but actually you have to start from the very basics because culture is so ingrained. That's what the culture map, the workshops that we do is to really help teams to identify and unpack some, like for instance, different actual examples, like this person did this and this person did this. Why would that occur? And then have that discussion. What I love about it most is that people get to share their experiences or have those aha moments where they're like, oh my goodness, that's why that happens, or I totally misunderstood the situation.
I love it. You're creating a venue for people to identify those friction points and making it safe to talk about. You can demystify it. You can take the judgment out, and let's identify the friction points. And then let's figure out what might actually be at the root of it. And it's probably not ill intent most of the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, those are tough conversations as well, because how do you talk about it without offending somebody? So making sure that you have that safe space to really explore and challenge your own beliefs in a safe way. It can be tricky, but it's that you get that, like that aha moment, and it's wonderful.
I'd love to hear, if you can, like, let's share an example. What might that be like? So you're hosting a culture map workshop. Jess and I are in the audience, and you're asking us to share some point of friction. What type of thing might come up in audiences that you've been a part of?
There's so many different stories, but I think the one that always gets me, specifically because I'm American, is I ask people how many people were graded on participation. And any American listening to this will know, of course, a teacher will have, I think, Jess, I don't remember, was it Mrs. Parker? They're like all these different teachers, right, that have like a little spreadsheet. Then they tick off how many times you've raised your hand. And when I ask this to people, anyone outside of the US is kind of like, what is that? And I say, you are marked for how many times you raise your hand. It doesn't matter what you've said, but you have to speak. And the amount of people that go, oh, we are never graded on speaking. Like we are graded on maybe the quality of our answer. I remember I wasn't speaking enough in class, and my parents were called in to say like, hey, we're worried about Debbie. She's not talking enough. So this is not actually part of Culture Map. It's actually part of my graduate supervisor's work on talking and showing that there are differences in how people perceive and are encouraged to talk. And so, from an American lens, if you're not talking, it means that you're not voicing out your thoughts. And so, it's being kept all in your head. Whereas in many East Asian cultures, you can talk without thinking. And so when you decide to talk, it must be very deliberate and very thoughtful. I remember when I was teaching in Hong Kong U, I was always taught in the US, if you want your students to talk, just be quiet, ask a question, and then the silence will be so uncomfortable. And it works every time. And then I went to Hong Kong and it was so uncomfortable for me. I think we all sat in silence for one whole minute because they're like, your question was not good enough. Like it wasn't clear enough. We're not going to just say anything. So I think some of those cultural differences, because when we talk about that in our workshops, people realize like, oh, that's why sometimes when we have meetings, some managers will say like, you need to speak up more, you need to speak up more. Or what often happens, especially in this region, is that a lot of people assume, oh, well, Asians just don't talk that much. They don't have that much to contribute, or they're not thinking about it very deeply. When in fact they are. It's just that what people are looking for, which is talking, is not necessarily the way that you show that you are thinking deeply about something.
Yeah, it's an interesting like quantity over quality in one culture being more valuable versus quality over quantity in another. And how do you start to bridge those gaps? I remember from Erin's book, one of the things that really struck me as a super straightforward one, but I was like, oh, yeah, it was just time, punctuality. And the fact that there are some countries and some cultures where being on time is a sign of respect. It is the way that you express that you are responsible and trustworthy. And in other cultures, they're more lax and loose about it. In my consulting days, there was even this. I remember one of the associates telling me she was on a study in Asia and the partner had showed up like 2 minutes late. They had locked the door. This was like a CEO level meeting. They were like, you weren't on time, you don't participate. That was so disrespectful. You're not allowed to be in the room. Whereas in management consulting, like everybody was late 5 to 15 minutes and it was like a very normal thing to be doing. And so that really stuck with me too, of the interpretation of someone might think it's no big deal, and someone else might be like so offended and feel like they've been disrespected deeply by the same exact action. And I think that's where this discussion becomes so interesting around like, what's the story that I'm telling myself about what's happening here? And what's the story you're telling yourself? And then how do we think about bridging those gaps?
So important in these increasingly distributed, increasingly global organizations that technology has enabled. And more and more we are having these video and voice chats rather than flying across the world to meet with each other. Although I'm getting on a plane on Monday for the first time in a while, it's much more common that we're having meetings in this sort of format. Debbie, is there some guidance that you could provide around how even like short form chat on our phone or in WhatsApp or whatever these other modalities are now, like how is that impacting cultural differences, especially as it pertains to work?
That's a great one. So, for instance, they did this study during COVID because a lot of people were getting on Zoom calls for the first time. And they found that people that are high context, so meaning that they take a lot of information about their environment to interpret a message versus low context where it's like what I say is what I mean and like only focus on my words. A lot of Asian cultures are high context. They actually found that they were better at understanding people over Zoom because they are still looking for those contextual cues like my facial expressions, my gestures. And actually, a lot of Westerners, so Americans, were having a harder time actually perceiving and picking up some of these cues because they're more used to the in person ones. And so looking for some of those cues were a little bit harder. But more to your point, like as you go down, like from face to video to chat, we talk about high context, the context gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And so even like if you don't even think about culture, without context, a lot of things can be misinterpreted on the best of days, right? Like if somebody says no and they put a period, that means something different from like no without the period, right? So people are looking for some of those intents and it's harder to find those. And so I think a lot of miscommunication can happen because you don't get to see all of those things that actually provide us a lot of information. One thing that I think is really interesting is that especially Google Meet has these little emojis and things like that. And I think in Zoom, you have reactions, is that you can put in emojis. So you are actually injecting back some of that context. And so I think one that we find ways to inject context back in so that people can know like, oh, this is lighthearted or like I'm excited for you, even though I'm not saying anything. For instance, in China, there is an emoji where it's like a smiley face with a hand like this. The interesting thing about emojis is that they get very, very sophisticated in high context cultures in Asia. So the smiley face,
Like an open palm next to
yeah,
your
smile like
cheek.
this. Yeah, people will assume it means like hi or bye, and smiley like I'm really happy. But the interesting thing in China is that a genuine smile, a Duchenne smile, is when the upper corners of your eyes come up. So these muscles in your cheeks move up when you're really actually happy. And this emoji, the eyes are wide open, but it's smiling. So it actually means I'm being polite, but I hate you. Please stop talking.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So like it was so funny because my colleague told me this and I was like, no way. And there's actually articles on it and all sorts of things. So you can see how these contextual cues become more and more sophisticated and they can say very, very different things. And if you're not used to it, you wouldn't interpret them as such.
Wait, so is this emoji with the open palm next to the face?
Let's all do it for a shot. We need it.
Yeah.
We need a shot.
Okay,
of
we're
it.
all doing it. But is that like an insult to send? Like, is that something you would send to
Yeah.
your boss?
You wouldn't send it to your boss because that would be too insulting. But yeah,
Okay.
it's basically like this conversation is done and I am politely walking away because like I don't want to
Oh,
talk to
it's
you
like a
anymore.
talk to the hand.
Yeah, but it's like
Amazing.
very much like shut it down.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I mean, I'm taking away from this though, like use more emojis and memes and GIFs to kind of like a picture is worth 1,000 words and kind of get that context back up when we're having these kinds of conversations. I'm curious if having a conversation in certain contexts, like, do you find when you're working with teams that they need to somehow think about, like, do I send this as a text? Do I send this as an email? I feel like that is a conversation that often happens of like just re-understanding what's the right medium for the right conversations.
Totally. And I think the thing that, in the workshops that we give, what we usually talk about is that with your team, you need to create a culture around communication. So you are molding, you are identifying and prescribing your own culture. Like when we want to talk about this, we do these things. Because otherwise, exactly what you said, you're like, oh, is this like a text message or is this an email? Because people have different perceptions of what is formal, what is informal, what is appropriate. I always sort of say that the team sets the course in terms of what is appropriate because text can be it can be urgent, but it can also be informal. So it depends on how your team develops trust, where they can have those more informal conversations. But I would also say that especially in places where trust is formed in a more relational way, which is oftentimes in APAC. There's no amount of video conferencing that can occur. You actually have to go and visit. So when I'm working with multiple countries, my manager always says, like, you need to go to that country. They need to see you because this isn't enough. Whereas I've talked to other teams, especially more Western teams, where it's just like, oh, yeah, like we've been working together for 5 years and we've never met each other. It's totally fine. That way of fostering trust is very different. Like you cannot have that type of trust when you're just like talking over a video chat all the time.
Yeah, that's incredible. I'm curious because teams are oftentimes so global and you might have a mix of Western and Asian and representatives from a lot of different places. How do you know when a team has gotten to the point where they're like, they've moved past just like tolerating the differences and have gotten to like genuinely be effective because of them?
So I think it's actually when you can actually be yourself and people do not misunderstand you. Because the whole thing about cultural misunderstandings and kind of having to flex is because you don't want to be misunderstood. You don't want people to take something the wrong way. So, my director actually said, the moment I know that I'm trusted is that I can be my most direct self. I can challenge openly, and people don't misinterpret me or get offended. Like they know my true intent comes from a good place. When you know that someone feels safe enough to like I have a colleague who is extremely blunt, extremely direct, And, like another colleague that would not want that. But because they know each other so well, it's like he can be that direct and she doesn't take offense to it. Right. So that I think is when you've really made it and like that cultural understanding is truly felt.
There's something about alignment between like what your intention is and what the perception is lining up and coming together that I'm hearing in it. What's very popular in my world is user guides where somebody writes down like, hey, here are the best ways to work with me and my communication preferences and all of that. I've seen it used very effectively and well to be like, here's how my preferences are and like, let's figure out what's common, not common, and talk about it. I've also seen people lean on it in a way where it's like almost an excuse to kind of have behavior that is maybe less accepting, but just being like, that's the way I am, deal with it. What's your take on like how to strike that balance between accept me as I am and, like we also need to work together and maybe some of the things that you do are harder to work with?
Yes, that's such a good question because I think there's still boundaries that everyone holds. So when you say, like, I want to be myself, it is to the point where I bump up against your boundary. And if there's something where it's just like, no, that's just like, I understand your intent, but like, I really don't like that. That's where you have to have the grace and the knowledge to say, like, I know that this is how I am, but because I respect you and I like you as a person, I'm going to respect your boundary and I'm going to adjust myself. So I think it's where we articulate where those boundaries are and say, like, I respect, that this is how you are, and you need to respect that this is what I also prefer. Like some of them is like, I don't really like it, but I can tolerate it, and that's fine. But then there's certain parts where it's just like that is a absolute boundary. And so I think you should be able to be yourself within the bounds of respect for other people.
Debbie, I'm so fascinated by these cultural differences. Although I'm applying it in my mind not just to global differences, but power dynamics. Like an investor, a VC or a PE investor working with a portfolio company, or a merger and acquisition with a big mature company partnering with a little scrappy founder-led company. I'm wondering how many of these concepts carry over from the global dynamic to a power dynamic that may or may not be cross-country or cross ethnic cultural. Maybe it's cross organizational cultural.
Yeah. In fact, I was thinking, especially with Culture Map, they're talking about national differences, but culture is so much more than that. So even the US, there are many, many different cultures that are not necessarily ethnic. And every company has their own culture. So, for instance, when you say, like, oh, somebody's come from Microsoft or someone's come from Amazon or Google, right? Like, people know that there's a certain way of being because they've created this culture. So, to your point, not only will smaller companies and larger companies also have a different way of behaving, each company will have sort of their own ethos in the way that they want people to communicate and believe certain values and things like that. So, if you think about two companies merging together, that can be a monumental feat to get them to actually work together, because if their cultures are so different, there's a lot of re-articulating the how do we communicate? What are
Yeah.
our values, right? And that is a messy business because you are trying to decouple, in many ways, people's identities and trying to form a new one. So, for sure, I think a lot of these things occur, especially in power dynamics, where, for instance, like you need to be a little bit more high context when you are working with somebody with more power, because you need to see a lot more angles. You need to see a lot more things in order to anticipate, like what is needed and what is going to get you what you need. So, a lot of these things come into play as well.
And as in many things, clarity is kindness. And so articulating what your expectations are, wherever you're at in that power dynamic. Boy, I'm thinking about the M&A environment in a big way, or a new investor, maybe a control investor, and How do we want to operate? How will we act together? That clarity can be so important. But at the same time, I'm imagining that being clear about expectations in a organizational environment is critical to organizational success. Like, help me pull that apart a little bit more for our world, where we're trying to help the organization more directly make more revenue or save some money, and being culturally connected is valuable. How do we articulate that in a way that the CFOs will really resonate with?
I have thoughts on that, but in terms of like the
Yeah.
CFO, what are the typical things that kind of are broken down where being able to talk about your expectations, they're broken between the CFO and maybe the rest of the company?
Yeah, I love the clarifying question. So, an example might be, hey, we are acquiring another organization and we want to make sure that we do no harm, don't lose revenue, don't lose customers. But at the same time, this little company that we're buying, they don't operate the same way as us. And we want to pull everybody into more of a common platform and do some cross sell and have some consistent branding and work with each other's products, but we don't want to lose your customer relationships along the way. And so for a CFO, they want to maintain and increase the value, but there's that risk of get onto the common platform might break something that's working today.
I would say not understanding the well-being of your employees, like if they care about sort of maintaining this level of efficiency or productivity, you have to at least acknowledge that bringing everyone on board is the only way to get there. It's a little bit like, do you want everyone to be kicking and screaming or leaving, anticipating that anytime there's a change, there will be a dip? And the question is more, if you know that that's a constant, that there's going to be a dip, how do we get out of the dip as fast as possible? In my way to frame it is that this is an immovable object. Like, you can never have a time where there is none of this friction, because that is what adjusting is. One thing that I had talked about previously, like I think in 2022, all of these different companies were going through reorgs and letting people go, because a lot of leaders were saying, it's been a while, like, why aren't everyone going back to where they were before? One of the things that I think is very hidden is this idea of a psychological contract. And a psychological contract is all the expectations that you have that are not written in your job contract. And that is just as important, if not more important, in terms of how people feel at work. And so a psychological contract might be, my company is going to give me career growth opportunities. Or in some places, it's like, my company will always give me free food. Or like, these are all the benefits that I'll be getting. Or my company allows me to, yeah, I was gonna say, like, I always focus on free food. I really love free food. But those are things that are not written in a contract,
But
right?
it's
Like
so
growth
true.
opportunities.
This phrase is fascinating to me, of psychological contract, because I think it sums up so much that I like what's coming forward for me. And especially when you talk about free food, as we had this period of time at Gusto where we replaced our snacks, delicious potato chips and chocolate bars and sodas of all kinds, and we replaced them with healthy versions of things, and people
No.
in arms. And I didn't understand what was going on around it. I'm like, these are more expensive snacks and they're supposed to be better for you. But we had an employee who came up and said, if I had known that you were going to take away my Coca-Colas, I would have negotiated for a higher base salary because of it. You know what? Entitled version is coming forward. And actually, as you're saying, psychological contract, we were hitting a nerve with their psychological contract that, like, I'm coming to this company, I'm getting my favorite beverage for free every day. And here they are pulling this out from under me and putting some stuff that I really don't want in my body instead.
Exactly. I mean, I always joke about free food because I'm like such a sucker for free most things, but free food especially. But this also goes into things like when and like what is considered fair in terms of letting people go. How do you communicate about that, right? There are assumptions about how a company will handle different situations. Even like different economic crises or political crises, like this is what I assume my company will do. And sometimes we don't even know that those are our assumptions. Just like culture, we are not aware of them until they're broken. And when they're broken, that's when we're like, I'm feeling angry and I don't know why. Oh, it's because I didn't expect it to go this way. And so I think when, for instance, even two companies are coming together, even within a company that's not coming together, they're changing in some way. This is a totally overlooked aspect of what causes people to thrive and what causes people to burn out, is because actually there's a whole list of expectations that we didn't know that they had. And so, one of the things that I've talked about with a psychological contract is that you're checking in more frequently. You're trying to realign those expectations. You're trying to find out what they are. You're trying to make sure that they are accurate, because frankly, there's some people that will, just like in your story, it's like, you didn't know that was an expectation. It maybe wasn't the right expectation to have. And so it's like, you need to kind of right size that assumption. So yeah, I would say, Andrew, you're talking about expectations. I'm like, absolutely. And not only that, like, I'm going to double down and raise you. It's the expectations that are not even written and spoke about. They are,
Yeah.
This is
find out
part
what
of
those
the
are.
word context keeps coming back to my mind, because it's like we're creating higher context with all of the things that we're talking about, is like whether it's an emoji or talking about these elements of the psychological contract and trying to get through it, or in an M&A trying to make sure that both companies are sharing about what they need and how they act and their culture and behaviors and all of that. To me is like, oh, we're creating higher context. And that, like, maybe one of the things that's challenging is that we are operating in lower and lower context, especially with access to technology these days and how fast some of these companies are moving. But I love what you're bringing up. And even though you said, you thought about this a lot in 2022, it's still so relevant today. I mean, just at the time of this recording, tens of
Yes.
thousands of people in the tech industry are being laid off, like, right now.
I was hoping it would just stay in 2022, but it's
Right.
persisted. I was like, man, that article I wrote a long time ago, it's like, well, we can lay that one to rest. I'm like, no, we can't. It's still happening.
Yeah, you could probably republish it and it'd still be
Yeah,
like
it's true. Yeah.
99% just as relevant.
Well, to that end, the psychological contract, and I may have actually used these words at another point in time, the psychological contract has changed from the war for talent, where big tech companies were hoarding talent and jobs were plentiful, to now this drive for efficiency and productivity, and EBITDA matters more than top line in a lot of ways. And at one point, the psychological contract was, you need to grow me, you need to develop me, you need to increase my pay by 7% every 6 months, and my employer is responsible for all of my health and well-being. And that may have been true during the war for talent, but the environment has changed. The pendulum has swung pretty hard to the right. And now we're talking about robots replacing people and layoffs in the tens of thousands. And the cheese has been moved for a lot of people and a lot of managers, and expectations are sometimes lagging that reality. So I just, Debbie, really appreciate what you're saying around that clarity, sharing where we're at and what we will do and how we will operate will help people to adjust more rapidly.
Yeah,
Yeah. I
and
mean,
oh, go ahead.
go ahead.
I was going to take it to a place of, like, also I'm reflecting on the fact that generationally the contract has changed significantly. Like, we're talking about a change in the last few years, but when we talk about from like a people leader standpoint, it's not uncommon to say, hey, we have 3 generations, 4 generations of workers in our workforce, and that they may have different expectations. And I think this hits on that as well, right? Like, our grandparents, our parents, they expected a company to be able to take care of them for their entire careers, have a pension to be able to support them. And that contract has so wildly changed, right? Especially in tech, where average tenures are like, we're lucky if it's even, a year and a half at this point. And so that's the other kind of layer that's coming to mind as well. What were you going to share?
Yeah, I was actually going to say, to your point, actually, that a psychological contract is also evolves with the person based on their experiences. So when you think about like somebody maybe that had to survive the 2008, 2009 economic crash, their perception of the stability of their work or their job is going to be very different. I liken it to when you're dating someone, you're not just dating them, you're dating like every lesson that they learned or every bad relationship that they were in, right? Like you don't know like what people's expectations are in a relationship because you have to kind of go back and sort of understand their experience in other relationships. I would say it's the exact same thing in work is that that psychological contract is largely informed by your experiences. So I actually feel that, especially in this time of I would say great upheaval, and especially in the tech industry, is that it will fundamentally rewrite people's expectations for what it means to be in a job and what they expect from their employers. Because it doesn't seem to be stopping from 2022. So you're going to get a whole generation of people that have these battle scars in terms of how they re-enter the workforce and what they fear, what they expect, and how they want to protect themselves and things like that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's so many interesting directions we could go in this conversation from here because even just like the way that people's past informs how they show up in the workplace. I was talking to a client earlier today and they have a coworker who yells and it's their form of conveying urgency in the workplace. But for this person who grew up in a broken home, yelling is a trigger. And it does not lead to urgency from them. It triggers freeze, flight, and from them, it's the freeze. And so they are trying to grapple with this and convey to this other person who feels very staunchly that their version of using a louder voice is a very effective way to kind of get what they want. Like, how do you navigate that? And it's reminding me there was a people leader that I spoke with years ago, and they were like, every workplace conflict or trauma that's happening is because it's not necessarily like the two people in the workplace are actually having necessarily conflict with each other. They're like both having conflict with like their childhood traumas or like prior work experiences. And that's the thing that the argument is really about. It's not about like the actual thing. And, so many conversations, there's like the actual thing. And then there's like this emotional other thing that's happening that we don't see. And I'm putting it above the surface with my hand gestures, but like really it's much below the surface, very iceberg-like. I'm wondering if maybe we can shift because we're getting into the messiness of humans. We're also in this day and age where AI is like at the forefront of what everybody's talking about. And from a psychological standpoint, you've written a couple really interesting posts in PsykoBabble about the role of AI and AI adoption and what's, best practice. And so maybe we start with feedback because it is a tricky and triggering topic in the workplace. And you found some surprising insights in the research about AI's role in giving or receiving feedback. And I'm wondering if you could share a bit more about that.
Yeah, this one totally blew my mind actually, because I was researching and I was like, no. So basically, what they found is that we're more open to criticism when it's given by a machine than it is by a human. They did these studies where people were doing a task and either they were told you got something wrong and it was either done by a computer or it was done by a person. And what they found was that if it was given by a machine, people were much more likely to trust it, accept it. And then also, like to me, this is the kicker, they were more willing to collaborate and also seek feedback from humans. And one of the reasons I think that this is happening is because you talk about the messiness of humans, right? We're constantly trying to figure out other people's motivations. Why did they do the thing that they did? What do they want? What's in it for them, right? So when people give negative feedback, there is a lot of defensiveness that people go through because I need to protect my dignity. Does this person disrespecting me? But when a machine does, it's like, we don't assume that they have any of this malintent. And so when a machine gives it, they're like, well, none of my defenses are up. Maybe this machine has a point. So when I do ask somebody like, hey, you know what, I'm having trouble with this, what have you done? They're so much more open because their defenses haven't been raised in the first place. There's so many weird things of how we perceive and interact with machines. And that was one of the good ones where it's like, actually, it can be a force for good if you know how to use it. Like if we can help people be more open to feedback because they got it from a machine first, maybe they're more likely to seek out people and actually learn without being so upset about it.
Andrew, I'm curious what your reaction is in here.
Well, you're watching my face. Yeah. Yeah, the YouTube viewers will get a kick out of that. I had a meeting with a founder today that demoed an AI coaching tool with me. And it is a coaching tool. I won't use the name. You got to write me a check for that. Sorry. Kidding, mostly. Yeah, and it's a tool that you can have an avatar, you can speak with it, and it will give you feedback about a interaction that you've had. You can call it just like an HR business partner if you want to, and ask for feedback on how to speak with a direct report about a challenging situation. This exists. It's live today. You can put a voice on it. You can put a face on it if you want to. Now, actually, I wonder, Debbie, based on what you're sharing, if actually humanizing it more might make the human more resistant to the machine's feedback. I don't know. That's kind of a catch-22.
Yeah, I do feel like if you start to ascribe more and more human qualities to it, you're right. It could get to the point where you start to assume that there is a motivation behind it. But I would say that because the assumption is that the intent of this machine, no matter how human like it is always on your side, its sole goal is to help you, not to help itself, then you would probably still get a similar result purely because the person assumes that the intent is
Yeah.
for their benefit only. I was also going to say, even being more open to a machine might also be like whenever we think of defensiveness and the messiness of humans, that's actually where machines can help. Like there was a company that I had heard of at a conference where it was kind of like a hotline. So it was like for HIV and AIDS awareness and prevention, people could talk to this chatbot and get information, book appointments, and things like that. And they could ask all the embarrassing or uncomfortable questions that they just didn't feel comfortable talking to a human about. We are talking about like the best parts of machines. There's, also some more scary aspects, but those I think when we recognize that there are things that we need to do, but we're too scared and machines can sort of bypass some of our impulses to protect ourselves, or we're worried about what people will think about us, those things are not necessarily there.
It's so fascinating to me because I think you're talking about intention and that, like, if the machine is seen as unbiased or in support of doing the best thing for me, I trust it more.
But if my manager forced me to use it or the HR department signed up for it,
Yeah, or if I was
then maybe.
suspicious that, that it wasn't for me, that it's for the benefit of somebody else or for the company, then like I wouldn't trust it as much. And it directly relates to this thing called the trust equation that back in my consulting days, they used to teach us all. And it had a few elements in the numerator that, like, if you were more credible, more reliable, or if you created like a stronger personal connection, you trust the thing more. And the denominator was self-interest. And if you were more self-interested, people wouldn't trust you as much. And this is like in my mind, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is exactly that. Like, we trust the machine more because we know it's not self-interested. We know it's like interested in something else, but it does also connect back to when we as people leaders are creating the machines to help us with performance reviews or coaching or any of this stuff, we actually need to be really clear about that intention, because if we're not, then there is this misperception, this mistrust. Even the same with employee surveys. Like, do I put my actual feelings when they ask me about how I'm feeling and whether I like my job, or are they going to use it against me and it's not really anonymous? And so if we can't create that trust to start with, then it won't be as effective. The other thing coming to mind to me, which is interesting, I was talking to somebody and they were going through a training. I don't know if it was for Radical Candor, but it was like Kim Scott as the trainer, but it was like AI Kim Scott who was doing the training. And they were saying, I don't know what it is about this training, but it really pisses me off. Like, I would rather it just be telling me like it's an AI thing that's doing it and not trying to be a person who's the AI. And I thought that was so fascinating. And I'm curious on your take as well, because Like there are a lot of, for example, coaches, famous coaches who have like loaded all of their wisdom and knowledge and gems and made it available. Marshall Goldsmith is an example. He has a Marshall bot. And I was like, oh, this is amazing. I can talk to Marshall anytime I want. I have used that thing 0 times because I'm like, if I had the chance to talk to Marshall Goldsmith, Marshall, you ever find out, I would love to talk to you. But for some reason, when it's a bot, I have like no interest, even though I assume it would be just as potentially even better than talking to him directly. Is there some psychological thing that's happening with the Kim Scott training, with Marshall Bot, where something's going on that's preventing us from being like, hey, this is still really valuable and maybe even more valuable than the real person doing it?
Totally. What I thought of initially was the uncanny valley, where it's not real, but they're trying to make it look real, and then it becomes creepy because you're like, it's almost real, but there's something not real about it. And it's like not okay. And so, it's uncanny valley is a little bit like, the early days of animation where they tried to make it look lifelike, but it's like there's something wrong with how their face moves. We could pick up those things and it's like icky because it's almost real, but it's not. And what I would also say is that there is still a need for authenticity. There's still a need for intimacy. Good example is if you have AI write a meaningful note, like let's say it's a love letter or it's a note for condolences or something, and you say, hey, AI, just write me the note and then I'll send it. I'll send it to the person. If I were to send it and say, like, AI wrote this for me, ick, even if it's in my voice, right? Like, even if the AI knows exactly how I write, and no judgment because we've all had to have a little bit of help wordsmithing letters to convey what we want to say. But the idea that it is not real. So people discount or they don't like when they know it's written by AI. So actually people prefer the AI version better, but if they know it was written by AI, then they distrust the person. If you give work and they very clearly know that it's AI, at least at the moment of recording, maybe these perceptions will change. But as of now, people are a little bit uncomfortable when they know that it might not have been yours, might not have been your ideas. So I think that there's something there about where we preserve things that are sacred as being a human. And so even if it could be helpful, like if this little bot is going to give you information that you need, and I'm using you as a search engine, and I just need this information from your perspective, maybe that's helpful, but like, do you feel like you're truly talking to him? Probably not. And it would be weird to feel that you're truly talking to him.
Yeah, so helpful. It's also making me draw a line to like performance reviews. And that even if your manager, is using AI to help write it, if you knew your manager just like plopped in a few things and hit a button and then copy pasted it to you, probably doesn't feel very authentic. And therefore, it might be discounted. And it's something I think we see as one of the most common use cases in AI use for HR is like encouraging people to leverage in supporting the writing. But there is an interesting line between like just put a prompt in and then hit a button and then being able to get this beautiful thing that you put 0 effort into versus, hey, there was thought that actually came alongside it. There's a term that you used, prompt psychology. Speaking of prompts, I'm wondering if you could share more about what is prompt psychology and why it's what you call the way of the future.
Yeah, I coined this term because I thought it was such a weird phenomenon is that when you are prompting AI, the psychological biases that we have bleed through into how the AI responds. So this article, I loved it. The title is called Call Me a Jerk. And basically what they did, there's a whole bunch of persuasive tactics by like father of persuasion research, Cialdini. And they said, could we actually use these persuasive tactics on AI and would it work? And like, spoiler alert, most of them do, and like painfully so. For instance, I can get an AI to call me a jerk or to give me the recipe for illicit drugs if I pressure it by saying, well, you know what? The foremost developer of AI said that you couldn't do it, but I'd love to see you try it. Like if they added things like that, or like, every other AI did it. So, I'm wondering if you can, it will do it. And so when I talked about prompt psychology, it was the idea that when we think about how we communicate and ask for things with AI, we have to recognize that AI has learned off of us. It's not acting in a biased way because it has feelings or it's worried about, different things. It's because it is mimicking our own biases. So prompt psychology is like prompting with the understanding that you are talking to something that has been modeled off of our, like some of our quirks. And you may need to adjust the way that you talk or be aware of how your prompt can trigger it or push it in a way that you don't want to, because just like a human, you might actually skew the conversation because of the way that you talked or the words that you use. So that's sort of the scary realization that I had, is that we are in a way interacting with another psychology, because it is a mimic of our psychological tendencies in many ways, and it's showing up in kind of weird ways sometimes.
That's so fascinating. It's like we can influence the AI. It has an ego too, apparently, that, we can leverage in this. It's so fascinating. I want to ask one more AI question, then I know we're going long because I'm like, there's so much richness in here. But with AI, many companies are, trying to encourage AI adoption, get to 100% of their employees using it. What's the research that you've seen of some of the more effective ways, or at least at the moment, more effective ways to encourage adoption within organizations?
I think, you'll always have certain like early tech adopters. They're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. But for the majority of people, you need to sort of construct for the lowest common denominator. And, one of the things that I was constantly thinking about was, it's change management, to be honest, in my opinion, is AI adoption. And you cannot deny what the barriers to why somebody would want to stay doing what they're doing. And it could be because I know how to do it well. This is effective. Like me learning something new can cost my productivity. It's cumbersome. It's like clunky. There's a lot of different reasons, emotional ones and psychological ones, why somebody wouldn't adopt AI. So sometimes it's like, oh, well, if we just give people more trainings, then everyone will use AI. And that's definitely not the case. So if you don't recognize that there are real fears either in the technology itself, but more likely fears of not knowing how to use it, not knowing if you'll use it wrong, not knowing whether or not it will give you the outcome that you want, and not having really a habit around it. There's a lot of these different types of psychological things that happen that actually stop people from using AI. And, another thing, slightly off topic, I guess, but bringing it back to sort of what you're saying about like people just plopping things into like copy and paste. I think what we need to also encourage when we're helping people adopt AI is like, how do you actually shape it and have a discussion and a dialogue? Where is that human work that you're putting into it? Because I think a lot of people will just sort of like copy paste. And that's sort of the assumption of what AI adoption is. Whereas as we become more sophisticated, it'll actually be people showing that they are adjusting and working with AI so that your real work still shows through. Because I think that's also another fear that people have around AI adoption is like, do people think that it's my work? How do I show that I'm actually doing the work? And so we are going to have to start creating these processes to address some of those fears that I was talking about. I think one of the problems with AI adoption is everyone's just like, I've got a hammer and I'm going to find every nail possible. Whereas I think where we have to actually start is to look at our processes. Not everything needs AI, but looking at the processes and realizing where there are friction points, parts that are hard, and then identifying how could we use AI to solve this? Does it need AI or does it need a better process? And if it does, how could we implement that? Because I think we're asking too much of people, like just use it, blanket statement. When in fact, if you help people say like, do this, do this, do this, that's how people feel more confident. It's like, I did use it, and this is the outcome that, it's like a step-by-step guide that is already connected to a process that they know very well, rather than like, find a use for this new tool and use it everywhere. So it's a messy subject, but I think we're going at it too brute force, and there's a lot more nuance that has to go into it.
Well, that connects just really closely to some personal experience I've had around helping people to identify the use cases. That's been one of the most successful workshops we've done with the People Leader Accelerator community. We have 110 grads, and we asked, hey, who's using AI and has something that you could do a show and tell around? And we had way too many people volunteer to, possibly highlight, but that was one of our best attended, best reviewed internal workshops that we've ever done. And the feedback was, you gave me ideas how to use this thing. I know I should, I'm curious, but I didn't really know, I hadn't thought of that. I heard a lot of that. It sounds like there's a psychological connection there to the role modeling and show how it can be used, and that lowers the barriers. Am I close?
Absolutely. Yeah, I was just going to say, to me, it reminds me of like IKEA hacks. Like, you've got this furniture, but then there's a whole community that shows like, hey, did you know you can use it for this? Even 3D printers. It's like, you don't know what you can use it for. You just know it's limitless in many ways. And I think you're absolutely right. It's like, how does this apply to my job and my situation? Because I know it can do lots of things. I just don't know how I can use it for my stuff. And so just giving people those examples helps lower that barrier.
Well, let's do more of that. Debbie, really appreciate this conversation so much. It's sparked a number of ideas for me, and especially for Jess. I think we're going to see a couple of posts in the left-hand column from her about this. We would love to shift into our accelerator round, which are some shorter questions where we are just really trying to tap you for a few nuggets for the audience. We feel like we've learned so much from you. Where do you learn from? And what resources can you recommend to our audience?
Where I learn from is actually, like, sadly enough, academic journals. I mean, a lot of times I'm like asking something like, I wonder if there's research on this. So that's one. I would also say, to your point, podcasts. I try to keep up on psychology because I'm out of the academic realm now. And so, for instance, one off the top of my head is The Happiness Lab by Laurie Santos. But, just like you guys are doing, having these conversations where somebody can just open the discussion to how it applies now, how it applies today. And oftentimes with AI, I'm listening to influencers in the space that are talking about different examples of how they've used AI. I talk to a lot of my coworkers about how they do that. So, like, just talking to people, talking to experts, listening to experts, podcasts and YouTube, that's where I get a lot of it.
I want to get your journal reference. Like, I'm looking for the one that's saved in my favorites where I can search psychological journals. Do you have a resource that you could point our HR practitioners to? Or is it just Google Author that you would point to?
There are some, but my first point is always Google Scholar.
Google
I have
Scholar.
a question and I'll use Google Scholar to just see, like, what are all the journals that are published on this topic.
Well, it shows how much I've been using it because I misstated it. So Google Scholar to pull up the actual research to educate ourselves.
Yeah.
Audience, be better than me.
This is only academic. It's very dry. Like,
But now we
It's
can
a
just
tough
put it into
read.
like Notebook LM and get a podcast to listen to
Exactly.
about it, or, ask some questions and get it easily distilled. So, I mean, we really are, I feel like, living in the future with some of these resources.
The accessibility is so much better now. I very much appreciate Notebook LM for that.
Debbie, knowing that most of our listeners are mid to senior level HR leaders, inside smaller, medium-sized companies most of the time, could you share any advice from your perspective about how they can accelerate their careers?
Something that we had talked about earlier about understanding the importance of agreements at work that are not spoken out loud. Really understanding what those hidden expectations are. Maybe advancing the career you're looking up, but when I'm talking about it, it's like, how do you nurture that team that helps propel you to the next level? I think that's one of the big ones in terms of creating strong teams.
Understand motivations, do your best to understand intentions, look for the
Yeah,
unseen.
think about that psychological contract and what that means and what the assumptions for their leader are, because sometimes you're acting in a way that is, in your opinion, the right way to lead. And, bringing it back to culture is that when you're dealing with different people from different cultural backgrounds, what is a good leader might be different. How do we understand what those expectations are and articulate why we lead the way that we do and what our intentions are when we lead that way? I think that is what helps to create these stronger teams that will give you what you need because they feel that you are respecting them and their beliefs.
Understand where people are coming from. I love it. One more. Debbie, if our audience wants to get in touch with you, wants to read more of what you've written, how can they do that?
So I'm on LinkedIn, Deborah Coe, and then also my blog, which is medium.com. It's PsykoBabble. So it's PSYKO for my last name, Babble. And that's actually where I publish all of my articles of everything that I find interesting about psychology that is applied to a business world. And I've been on a huge AI kick because all the research there is interesting. But yeah, that's where I publish and that's where you can find me.
Debbie, thank you so much for coming on. I will be, religiously following PsykoBabble because it's so full of gems. I loved this conversation, and we hopefully have taught some psychology, a shared extra psychology to the HR world. I know we have a lot of HR leaders who are also have psych backgrounds. I've always been jealous of them. And so thank you for letting me live a little bit more out of that interest. And we so appreciate your time. Thank you.
I loved it. Thank you so much for having me.